Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is a really clear expectation of precision. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows this jagged white line, the doctor points right at it, puts a cast on it, and you're just on your way.
Right, yeah. It's a very mechanical, visible process.
Exactly. And that visual proof is, well, it's comforting.
Oh, absolutely. We are totally wired to want to see a physical fracture so we can apply a physical fix. I mean, it gives us this sense of control over the healing process.
Right. But today's deep dive takes us into a landscape where, frankly, the x-ray machine is entirely useless. We are exploring the way early childhood trauma physically shapes the developing brain.
Yeah, specifically looking at a condition called reactive attachment disorder, or RAD.
Yes, RAD. And our grounding source for this is excerpts from the MentalSpace School Guide to Reactive Attachment Disorder. So if you are a teacher, a parent, or honestly just someone who loves understanding human psychology, this deep dive is your shortcut to getting well-informed on a topic that completely upends our traditional playbook for childhood behavior.
It really does force a complete paradigm shift. Because, when we deal with neurodevelopment, the outward symptom, the behavior you're actually seeing in a classroom, it rarely points straight to the root cause.
Yeah.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
It really is. And the guide makes it very clear that we cannot begin to understand a 10-year-old's disruptive behavior today without looking at their first 5 years of life.
Which is such a critical window.
Right. And I want to pause on that timeline for a second because the popular understanding of childhood memory is that kids, well, they don't really retain much before age 4 or 5.
Sure, people say, oh, they won't remember this.
Exactly. Most people assume that if a child experiences instability as a toddler, they will just, forget it and move on.
Well, what's fascinating here is that while you might not have explicit episodic memories from that age, like, remembering the layout of a specific room or a conversation, your nervous system has an incredibly durable implicit memory.
Wait, implicit memory?
Yeah. In those first few years, the brain is quite literally building its operating system based on environmental feedback. It's laying down the actual neural pathways for how to process stress, how to seek comfort, and basically how to relate to other human beings.
Okay, let's unpack this. So it is not a memory of an event. It's a structural adaptation.
Exactly.
And the source points to 3 primary catalysts for RAD developing before age 5.
Yeah.
Early neglect, severe instability, or constant rotating caregivers.
Right. Those are the big 3.
So if an infant cries and the response is either prolonged silence or just total chaos, the brain doesn't just experience sadness. It writes a biological rule for survival. It's kind of like trying to run an operating system on a computer where the fundamental code for trust was just never installed.
That is a perfect analogy. The rule literally becomes reaching out is a waste of energy. Or even worse, reaching out brings danger. Yeah. From an evolutionary standpoint, an infant is entirely dependent on a caregiver. If that caregiver is unreliable, the child's brain has to adapt to survive what it perceives as a hostile environment.
So it just shuts down the biological drive for attachment.
Precisely. The fundamental wiring for trust and comfort simply does not get built.
Let me make sure I am grasping the physical reality of this. Because we are not talking about a child who is just a bit shy or, stubborn.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a nervous system that has categorized adults and vulnerability itself as existential threats. The defense mechanism is to just stop signaling for help, because they learned early on that adults couldn't be counted on.
That is the absolute core of it. If reaching out repeatedly results in nothing or just inconsistency, the most logical thing for a developing brain to do is to prune those neural pathways.
To just cut them off?
Yeah, it is a brilliant, albeit tragic, protective measure. If a child does not expect comfort, they cannot be devastated when it fails to arrive.
Which means by the time they reach, say, a 3rd grade classroom, they are essentially wearing a suit of armor built for a war zone that they are no longer in.
Exactly. But because this survival mechanism is entirely internal, the way it manifests outwardly creates this massive blind spot for educators.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The symptoms listed in the MentalSpace guide are deeply counterintuitive. It's truly classroom camouflage.
It really is.
For instance, a kid falls on the playground, they scrape their knee, and a teacher naturally goes to put a reassuring hand on their shoulder. But instead of leaning in, the child physically recoils. They actually flinch at warmth.
Right, and to understand the flinch, we have to look at the neurobiology of perceived threats.
Okay.
For a child with RAD, physical proximity or emotional warmth from an adult triggers the amygdala. That's the brain's threat detection center.
So the warmth itself is the trigger.
Yes.
Okay.
The brain associates vulnerability with pain. So when the teacher offers a hug or a pat on the back, the child's nervous system does not interpret it as safety. It interprets it as a trap or a loss of control.
Wow. That has to feel like a massive personal rejection to a teacher who is just trying to be nurturing.
Oh, totally. It goes against all our instincts.
And the source lists other surprising behaviors, too. It says these kids are heavily hypervigilant, just constantly watching the room. They rarely display joy, and they show unexplained irritability or sadness, even with a familiar, safe caregiver.
Right. Well, the hypervigilance is a classic trauma response.
Hmm.
They're scanning the environment because their early coding taught them that danger is omnipresent.
And no one is going to protect them.
Exactly. The baseline state of their nervous system is basically a low-grade fight or flight.
But if I am a teacher and a student is constantly bouncing their leg, refusing to do their worksheet, and just staring at the door or watching everything the other students are doing, my immediate instinct is to think, oh, this is ADHD.
Right.
Or if I tell them to sit down and they flat out refuse, my brain says, this is defiance. They just want attention. So why is this mislabeling so dangerous? And how do we differentiate between a child who just can't focus and a child with RAD?
This raises an important question, because you have to look at the underlying mechanism driving the behavior. With ADHD, you're generally looking at a dopamine regulation issue.
Okay, so the brain is seeking stimulation because it is understimulated.
Yes, but with RAD, the child is not looking for stimulation. They're performing a desperate scan for physical or emotional threats. The outward behavior, looking around the room, not focusing it, looks identical. But the internal engine is completely different.
That is wild. And what about the defiance, like a kid just saying no to a basic instruction?
Well, if a teacher tells a child to do something, and the child's internal operating system says, adults are unsafe, do not let them control your movements, that child might refuse.
And that looks exactly like oppositional defiant disorder on the surface.
Exactly. But treating a trauma response as a mere behavioral issue is catastrophic.
Because if you react to their refusal with anger or immediate punishment, you're just confirming their core belief.
Right. You are proving to them that adults are unpredictable, angry, and cannot be trusted.
You are actively feeding the trauma loop.
Yes. And this is why the source material stresses that diagnosis must come from a licensed clinician who actually understands the nuances of early childhood trauma.
Because an educator can't be expected to see the invisible X-ray.
Right. When schools try to guess, or when they just apply standard behavioral labels to attachment trauma, they trap the student in a really destructive cycle of misdiagnosis and inappropriate interventions.
Which brings up a massive issue with how schools typically operate. I mean, the entire K-12 system is built on a very specific behavioral foundation.
Rewards and consequences.
Exactly. You follow the rules, you get a reward, you throw a book, you get a timeout or a detention. The logic is just basic cause and effect. But the MentalSpace Guide states that traditional behavioral consequences alone will completely fail these kids.
They absolutely will.
So what does this all mean? I struggle to see how a school can function if they can't use basic discipline.
Well, consider the actual mechanism of a traditional consequence, like a timeout. The punishment of a timeout is the temporary removal of connection. It relies entirely on the assumption that the child desires to be part of the group, right?
Right.
And that the pain of being isolated will motivate them to comply and rejoin the group.
Oh, I see. A child with RAD doesn't care about the rupture in connection because they never trusted the connection in the first place.
Exactly. They prefer the isolation. You aren't punishing them by sending them to the corner or out into the hall. You are giving them exactly what their fortress was built to achieve.
Distance from adults.
Yes.
It's like trying to punish a plant for wilting by putting it in a dark closet. You can give it a failing grade in being green all you want, but until you provide the water and sunlight it actually lacks, the structural problem remains.
That's exactly it.
For these children, that missing nourishment is a sense of safety. So if traditional discipline doesn't work, what does the source offer as the actual solution?
The optimistic reality here is neuroplasticity.
Meaning the brain can change.
Yes, attachment can be repaired. The brain can be rewired. But the treatment must focus completely on the relationship. Specifically, attachment-based therapy.
So you can't just consequence your way out of it.
No, you cannot. It requires steady, predictable, patient connection. The adults have to absorb the child's rejection without retaliating. They have to consistently signal safety, day after day, until the child's nervous system finally registers that the threat is gone.
Okay, the guide mentions intensive coaching for caregivers and teachers to help facilitate this, but
Yeah.
realistically, asking a public school teacher to absorb rejection, remain completely emotionally neutral, and provide specialized trauma connection while managing 29 other students.
And preparing for standardized tests.
Right. It's a complete fantasy. Teachers are educators. We are essentially asking them to be unlicensed trauma clinicians.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the paradigm shift. Replacing rapid behavioral consequences with slow, predictable connection requires a massive adjustment in how schools respond to disruptions. The systemic gap between what these children need neurologically and what a standard public school can actually provide. It's the greatest hurdle in pediatric mental health right now.
Which is where the source material pivots from psychological theory to outlining a tangible systemic infrastructure. It details how MentalSpace School is actively tackling this barrier in the state of Georgia.
And they are doing it in a very comprehensive way.
Yeah, they aren't just handing teachers a pamphlet on trauma, they're embedding comprehensive K-12 mental health support directly into the school ecosystem.
The crucial element of their model is providing dedicated therapist teams for each specific school. They aren't outsourcing the problem to some random clinic across town.
Which usually takes months to get into anyway.
Right. They are integrating licensed professionals into the daily environment where these behavioral crises actually occur.
And the guide also emphasizes same-day teletherapy. Just think about the mechanics of that during a school day. A child has a severe trauma response, the teacher is overwhelmed, and instead of suspending the kid or putting them on a 6-month waiting list,
There is an immediate same-day intervention available.
right, it intercepts the crisis at the moment of combustion. That relieves so much immense pressure on the teachers.
It does. And furthermore, they offer wraparound services that support the entire ecosystem, because repairing attachment cannot just happen between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m.
It needs the whole community.
Exactly. They handle crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, and family counseling. They even provide staff wellness programs, recognizing that teachers experiencing secondary trauma need their own support systems to prevent burnout.
But the systemic roadblocks aren't just about staffing, though. I mean, they are largely financial and administrative. The guide lays out their compliance and access structure, and honestly, it reads like a blueprint for dismantling socioeconomic barriers to mental health.
Because financial friction is the ultimate gatekeeper in mental health care.
Totally. If specialized attachment therapy costs $150 an hour, the families who need it the most are automatically locked out. But according to the guide, for students on Medicaid, the cost is strictly $0.
And that completely democratizes access.
It really does. And they cast a massive net beyond that, too. They partner with major insurance providers. The source lists Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna, Aetna, United Healthcare, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup.
By accepting that wide range, they eliminate the need for families to navigate those awful out-of-network reimbursement nightmares.
Exactly. And on the school's end, they handle the administrative burden. They use culturally competent, diverse, licensed therapists. The services are fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant.
Which is huge for schools worried about liability.
Oh, for sure. And they specifically support Georgia schools with HB 268 compliance, well ahead of the July 2026 deadline. And just a quick note for you listening, if you want to look at the mechanics of this model yourself, the source directs you to mentalspaceschool.com, or you can reach them at mentalspaceschool@shitchtherapy.com.
When you look at those access details, removing the financial barrier with $0 Medicaid and handling the legal compliance for the district, you completely change the trajectory of a community.
You let the teachers teach.
Exactly. You allow the educators to focus on teaching, while licensed clinicians focus on the complex, slow work of rewiring the trauma response.
It is a systemic solution to a deeply biological problem. Wow. We have covered significant territory today. We started by looking at how early instability in the first 5 years of life alters the developing brain, literally forcing a child to shut down their capacity for trust just to survive.
And we analyzed how that survival mechanism creates a camouflage effect in the classroom. The hypervigilance and the flinching at warmth.
Right, the things that are so easily misinterpreted as ADHD or defiant disorder.
Which leads to those ineffective and often harmful disciplinary reactions.
Yeah, we broke down the mechanics of why traditional punishments like timeouts completely fail these students because isolation is exactly what their trauma wants and why the only path forward is patient, predictable, attachment-based therapy.
And finally, we explored how MentalSpace School is bridging that massive gap between theory and reality in Georgia, using dedicated therapist teams and broad insurance access to provide the infrastructure schools desperately need.
It really demonstrates that while human behavior can seem, impossibly complex on the surface, understanding the underlying mechanisms allows us to build systems that actually heal rather than punish.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, there is a lingering concept from the source material that extends far beyond the K-12 classroom, something for you to mull over on your own.
Yeah. We spent this time dissecting how powerfully a developing brain adapts to early instability, completely altering how a child receives warmth or processes a perceived threat by age 5.
Right.
And it prompts a broader reflection. If a child's developing brain can adapt so powerfully, and early survival mechanisms are capable of fundamentally restructuring the nervous system's baseline, how many of our own adult reactions are rigid emotional walls, our sudden irritability, or our interpersonal struggles at work or in relationships are simply outdated childhood survival strategies still quietly running in the background.
Oh, wow. That forces you to look at literally every interaction through a slightly different lens. The fractures in our foundations might not show up on a traditional X-ray, but once we understand the mechanisms behind them, we can finally do the slow, necessary work of repairing the damage. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.